Before you start writing that comment, no, I don't think that Gukesh is the worst ever world champion. But surprisingly, it's a topic that I've seen circling as of late, and it got me wondering, is there actually a way to quantify who is the worst ever world champion, and if so, who is it? So I thought it would make for a fun video on this channel to actually figure out from a statistical standpoint who it is. Of course, you could just ask ChatGPT who is the worst and it would say Max Yu, but I wanted to make a video with my own research to find out from a statistical standpoint who is actually the worst. Before we do start today's video though, the content on this channel would not be possible without our sponsor, ChessMind.AI. ChessMind is a next-generation AI-powered chess improvement platform. Not only does ChessMind have completely free puzzles, but they also have a wide range of courses you can select from for less than $5 per month. All of the courses are handcrafted by Chilean Grandmaster Mauricio Flores and are designed to make you a master of any opening variation in around an hour. They perfectly balance top-quality theory with ease of learning to take the boring out of any study. Once you've completed these opening courses, you can either play puzzles deriving from said opening or dive into their AI integrations which quiz your knowledge on what you've just learned. The AI acts as a replacement for a coach, asking you to find characteristics of certain positions and explain the advantages and disadvantages. You can check out ChessMind.AI with my link in the description, where you can get 20% off your subscription. But now let's start the video by looking at all of the parameters. By the way, this video absolutely does not insinuate that any of the players mentioned in this video are bad chess players. If I could reduce my lifespan by 50% for someone to make a video about me calling me the worst ever world champion, I would probably do it. Everyone mentioned in today's video are exceptionally talented human beings, and this video was just a little bit of fun. With that being said, this video aims to find the worst ever world champion. But what actually makes a world champion the worst? Because you could say that Anatoly Karpov is the world's worst chess champion, because he's currently 74 years old and probably wouldn't fare so well against the super grandmasters of our time. You could also say Louis-Charles Labourdonnais is the world's worst chess champion, because he played chess in 1834 when the standard of chess was a lot lower. So it's clear we need to set some parameters. First of all, we're not going to include any undisputed world champions for this list. So titles between 1993 and 2006 will be voided, thus removing Alexander Khalifman, Ruslan Ponomaryov, Rustam Kasimdzhanov, and Veselin Topalov from our list. I feel including these players would be unfair, as the World Championships at this time weren't really designed to be defended and don't accurately represent who was the greatest chess player of that time. Secondly, we want to make sure we don't go too far back in time, so someone like Labourdonnais is an easy scapegoat. So for the purposes of today's video, we'll only go back as far as 1886 with Wilhelm Steinitz. Next, it's important to note that it's a very cheap argument to make that someone like Jose Raul Capablanca would be absolutely demolished by a modern-day grandmaster. This is completely true. Capablanca did not play chess with modern-day engines and modern-day theory, and he would get swept off the board by almost every player within the top 10. However, it can be argued that if he was born in this generation with all of our technology, he would have been a much better player than he was. Because of this, the term weak should be seen as by comparison of the players that played chess at the time. Kind of in the same way that we don't consider Magnus Carlsen weak because he can't beat the highest level of a chess engine. It's just an unfair comparison. Now, we mainly want to analyze these players from the moment they became a world champion to the moment they had to defend their title. This means that any world champion who successfully defended their title probably shouldn't even be close to this list. There are no edge cases either, so we can immediately remove a few players. This includes Magnus Carlsen, Viswanathan Anand, Garry Kasparov, Anatoly Karpov, Tigran Petrosian, Wilhelm Steinitz, Alexander Alyakin, Mikhail Botvinnik, and Emanuel Lasker. Just to clarify, even though he's only been an undisputed champion once, we'll also remove Vladimir Kramnik from this list as he's won 3 world championships and obviously doesn't belong in this conversation. We can also project that Bobby Fischer is going to be an outlier in all of our data. He's a one-time world champion and didn't play much chess after winning his title, not to mention he didn't defend his title either. I think we can all agree that Fischer doesn't belong in this conversation either, so we'll remove him too. With all that being said, we're left with Ding Liren, Gukesh Damaraju, Mikhail Tal, Vasily Smyslov, Max Yu, Boris Spassky, and Jose Raul Capablanca. Now, some of these names may seem like they belong nowhere near this conversation, but statistically speaking, we have no reason to exclude them yet. So now we need to start grabbing some data. For our data, I think anything that happened before the candidates tournament that qualified them for the World Championship should be ignored. Although you could argue that their overall careers indicate the pedigree of a world champion, for the sake of this video, we're only going to be looking at the candidates to their title defense. So we can split the video into 3 simple sections: their World Championship cycle, their World Championship defense, and all the time in between these 2 points. By the end of the video, we should have a decent statistical conclusion on who the worst world champion is. So let's start with the world championship cycles. This section gets a little bit weird because of inconsistencies on how the world championship cycles have worked over the years. Players like Capablanca and Yu skipped the candidates entirely, while some world championship matches were double the length of others. So how do we quantify all of this? Well, considering we've already acknowledged the relativity of elo at any given time, all we need to quantify is the amount of games that players play in these kind of tournaments. So the easiest way of doing it is by calculating the percentage of total points each player picked up in either their candidates tournament or their world championship match. It's important to note, due to Yu and Capablanca not playing in the candidates, we have no data on them. Also, because Spassky's candidates was a knockout format, we also can't quantify it. However, for the remainder of players, we can. Ding scores the worst in the candidates, picking up only 57% of his available points. Smyslov scores second worst, picking up around 63.9, whilst Gukesh picked up a few decimal points higher on 64.3. By far, Tal played the best, picking up 71.4 of his points, dominating his candidates. Considering every player has quantifiable data for their world championship match, the next step should be rather easy. Max Yu played the worst, picking up just 51.67. Sorry, I'm 23 years old. Max Yu played the worst, picking up just 51.67% of his available points, with Spassky not far ahead with 52.1. Then it's Ding and Gukesh tied on 53.57, with Smyslov ahead of them on 56.82. Mikhail Tal is miles clear on 59.52%. However, it's Capablanca that blew everyone away with 64.29%. This is all well and good, but how can we give players an accurate rating when a lot of them haven't played candidates tournaments? Well, there's no reliable way of figuring out this, but we can kind of predict what their candidate scores might have looked like based on the rest of the data that we have. Of course, this should not mean anything and is more so just for the fun of the video, but on average, players score 8.31% more points in their candidates tournaments as opposed to their world championship performances. Admittedly, this is a big assumption to make, but I feel like this analysis is impossible without a few assumptions. So now our updated percentages look like this. We can now average these out, giving us our final rankings for players who performed best and worst across their respective candidates tournaments and world championships. This formula seems to pass the eye test too, with standout players like Capablanca and Tal finishing first and second, with Ding Liren and Max Yu finishing in the bottom two. I will reiterate at this point, this is probably not the best mathematical way to do this, but it seems relatively on the right track, and anything more complex will make my brain explode, so let's move on. Now we need to take a deep dive into each player's victory lap. This means how players performed between their two world championship matches. For the candidates tournaments, we specifically did not take into account the elo of all of the opponents. This is because we can't penalize players for being forced to play against weaker fields. The candidates should represent the strongest players at the time. However, in regular tournaments, you could just play the Louisiana State Championship and get 100% of your points. So we need to have a way of taking all of this into account. However, it's important to acknowledge elo inflation over the years, so what we're going to do instead is take a look at world rankings at any given time. We'll use the same methodology of using a total points claim statistic to figure out who is the best and who is the worst between the two periods. I've also made a weight system, so beating players within the top 10 is much more valuable than beating players between 50th and 100th in the world. I'll put those figures on screen now. It's important to mention you might think this is weighted unfairly, but there's no real right or wrong answer to how much they should be weighted. So now, with these new weights, a win against the world number 1 is worth a lot more than a win against the world 99. Also, to keep things simple, we'll ignore games played against players outside of the top 100. These games are few and far between, and it also helps just to quantify our data a little more accurately. Honestly, a lot of this part of the video is very boring. I spent something like 10 hours putting together an Excel sheet and inputting all of the data manually. There was one problem with all of my data though, and that's because Smyslov's World Championship title defense happened only 1 year after he won the World Championship to begin with, and he barely played any games in between. Tal also didn't play too much in between his two World Championships either, but there is enough data for this video. On the other hand, Capablanca had a 5-year gap between his two World Championships, so he played far more than the rest of the players. But in the case of Vasily Smyslov, I just went through the games in the year leading up to his first World Championship and used that data instead. That might not be the best way to do things, but I didn't really see any other way of doing it. All in all, here are the percentages of total points claimed by each player. Yu, who is considered the worst ever world champion, actually claimed the most on 73.9%, with Tal not too far behind. Capablanca is next on 71.8%, with Spassky and Smyslov sitting around 60%. Gukesh surprisingly sits on just 53.5% of possible points claimed, with Ding Liren sitting way below on 37.1%. But those are just raw percentages without being weighted, so let's weigh them. It's important to note that my way of weighing these results might not necessarily be right. How much more valuable wins against players in the top 10 compared to 50th to 100th is completely subjective. But after weighing the results, some very interesting things happened. Yu's percentage dropped slightly, meaning Tal was the most dominant player between his championships. Capablanca, Smyslov, and Spassky's figures didn't change much, but the two modern players in this list shot up significantly. This is simply because modern players will play tougher opponents much more frequently than their historical counterparts. So, whilst it may look like someone like Gukesh is struggling in between his championships, he's actually on par with the likes of Capablanca. Once you weigh it all in, he sits on 68.2%. However, although Ding Liren's 37% did shoot up to 50%, he is still by far the worst performing player in between his two championships, almost 12% lower than Smyslov and Spassky. It's also worth theorizing that Spassky and Smyslov also played chess in a very drawish era of Soviet chess. This could have reduced their percentages significantly. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think about that, but for now let's look at title defenses. This is probably going to be the easiest part of the video because every player defended their title and we already know how to quantify it. The only problem is Gukesh hasn't defended his title yet, but that almost makes him exempt from our list for now, but we'll do the rest of the video anyway. But this part of the video is going to be very easy, as I said. Because the World Championship is designed to be the two best players in the world, we don't need to worry about what elo anyone was. We simply look for the percentage of total points scored. And here we have it. Ding Liren actually had the best title defense with 46.4% of points picked up. Smyslov was close behind, then Spassky, Tal, and Yu were all in and around the same ballpark with around 40%. Of course, it could be argued that some players on this list had to play against much tougher opposition. I mean, Ding Liren played against someone else that's in this list. But at that point, we would be getting opinionated and not statistical. So we'll leave this section at that and come back with a summary of everything. Now, let's remind ourselves of everything that we've looked at in this video. Here are each player's candidates' records that led them to challenging for their first World Championship. We can see Ding Liren, the only player to not win a candidates, finished bottom here with a total of 57% of points picked up. Again, we didn't weigh any of these percentages because the candidates is specifically designed to have the best players in the world. No player should be penalized for that. Tal dominated his candidates tournament, but Yu, Capablanca, and Spassky didn't compete in a tournament as it didn't exist. But Yu, Capablanca, and Spassky didn't have data, so we predicted their percentages. It must be said, even when combining both candidates' performances and World Championship performances, it still roughly equates to the success each player had in the World Championship alone. Capablanca had the most dominant win with 64% of games won, followed by Tal on 60%. The most unconvincing being Yu on 52%, with Spassky, Liren, and Domaraju all not too far ahead of him. When we looked in between their World Championships, Tal performed the best with a weighted 73% win rate. Yu, Capablanca, and Gukesh all scored similarly. Smyslov and Spassky scored just 60%, but it's also important to note Spassky didn't play any games in between his two World Championships, so we had to source our data from the year leading up to the initial World Championship. Ding, however, scored just 50%. Being the worst performing player by far. As far as title defenses go, Ding scored the best, with Smyslov and Capablanca close behind. Spassky, Tal, and Yu had rather poor title defenses though. So what did we find? Well, with the nature of chess changing so much throughout history, it's really nothing concrete. But we can at least remove some players from the conversation. Capablanca played well in both his World Championships and played well in the time between them, so he's obviously not a candidate whatsoever. Tal dominated his candidates tournaments and crushed his first World Championship. He played well until he had to defend his title and simply lost out to a better player at the time. I don't think he fits into the conversation either. Similarly, I don't think that Yu should even be close to this conversation at all. Although he narrowly won his first World Championship, he was so incredibly dominant until his title defense, where he played poorly. I know this might be a popular opinion, but go and do your own research and see how dominant he was in this period. It was unbelievable. So that leaves us with 4 players: Smyslov, Spassky, Gukesh, and Ding. I'm also going to write Gukesh off this list as well, just by comparison of Ding Liren. Gukesh played better in his candidates tournaments and played equally well in his first World Championship match as Ding Liren. Gukesh significantly played better in between his 2 World Championships, and despite not having defended his title yet, he would have to lose in such a decisive way that his World Championship legacy would be worse than Ding. So now we're just down to Ding, Smyslov, and Spassky. Statistically, how can we separate them? Well, Smyslov had a much better candidate's performance than Ding, and a more decisive World Championship win. In the year leading up to his World Championship, he picked up over 10% more points than Ding. Even though that's not quite accurate for the video, I think it's an assumption that we're forced to include to statistically separate them. Smyslov had a relatively similar title defense as Ding Liren, even slightly better, so I feel statistically we can comfortably rule out Smyslov. Now for Spassky. Spassky actually did play in a candidates, but we couldn't accurately quantify it. However, he did win his candidates, which is at least equal to Ding Liren coming second. Spassky scored 12% more points in between his World Championships than Ding Liren, and although in his title defense he performed much worse, he had to verse Bobby Fischer. It's obviously so incredibly harsh to say, but statistically speaking, Ding Liren is definitely the worst world champion. It's important to say this analysis does not include players' overall careers. I would have had to sort through a lifetime of games to accurately reflect that, and we would also need to somehow quantify the value of honors from 100 years ago. For example, chess tournaments that we watch today are relatively new, and there are no corresponding tournaments from 50 years ago. We judge players' careers based on not only their strength, but the titles that they've won. And if we can't quantify it, there's no statistical way to determine an outcome. But other than that, we have our answer. If you guys would like to see another video like this, but instead looking at the best world champion, leave a comment below and let me know. But apart from that, I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next video.